Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is John Robb, a regular guest on our show. John's a thinker and writer about global level systems and conflicts. His main platform is Global Gorillas on Patreon. You can Google it, or you can find the link on this podcast's episode page at jimrutt.com. I've been a longtime contributor to John's support on Patreon, and I'd encourage you to do so too. We don't have independent voices like this if we don't reach into our pockets and help them make a living. So, John, let's jump into a couple of three things that you've talked about over the last few days on your very interesting Twitter stream. The first is very interesting development. The website defeatdisinfo.org has sprung up. And frankly, I predicted something like this back in 2012. Tell us about what defeatdisinfo.org is, and what do you think the implications are?
Well, it's built on the same kind of software that was developed to run counter-narrative efforts against terrorist groups. There were a lot of efforts undertaken over the last decade or so, particularly in response to ISIS, trying to run counter-narrative. And that there's lots of companies involved in that too. I mean, there's a Google wing or subventure that focuses on that. It's basically a kind of system that when it sees a narrative develop that could promote a terrorist group, it would then counter that narrative quickly and spread that the counter narrative out to a lot of influencers. In this case, Defeat Disinfo is focused on Republicans and Trump. For example, if Trump says something like, "Why don't you take disinfectant internally?" they would run a counter narrative, and then spread out the information, or that the pandemic is similar to the flu. They would run a counter narrative against that. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell.
Oh, and then the key part, at least as I saw it, is that they're recruiting an army of people to be their spreaders, right? They don't seem to use bots per se, but rather they are organizing a decentralized narrative multi-broadcast point with potentially hundreds of thousands of people who are taking their counter arguments and posting them in a fairly regimented and highly automated way, by the way, on Twitter and Facebook and various other platforms, emailing them to people, etc. And so this is essentially automating and organizing what's been happening in a unautomated and disorganized way via propagation of memes and links across social media and email.
Well, it's focusing on getting those key influencers, those independent influencers, to retweet the counter narrative or to post about it or write about it. And I mean, recruiting an army of people to make that possible, or to distribute the information and get it into the hands of those key influencers is just a way of working around the rules that Twitter and other sites have, blocking bots. What they're looking for is what they call inauthentic communication, inauthentic posts, whatever that means. So this is a way of working around that. If you get a lot of people enlisted to do this, then you can avoid getting snagged by those rules.
At least probably. Maybe they'll say, collusion. We just saw 17,000 retweets of the same post or the same link. Seems improbable. We'll see if there's a counter arms race against this.
Oh yeah, well, most definitely there will be. I mean, it's kind of like IEDs and counter IEDs. There's an innovation in IED design, and then there's a counter that comes out months later, 6 months later, and then 2 weeks later, there's another innovation that neutralizes the counter IED work. So, this is definitely an arms race. It's a global information war. It's an interesting maybe direction for where parties are going. Political parties, political networks are, recruiting, tens of thousands, if not millions of people to amplify a message.
Yep.
To get it out and doing it in a formalized way. I mean, that's how parties evolve online, is that they used to do it through influencing news coverage, and now recruiting 1 million people to amplify a message and doing it in a formal way is probably how they earn their support.
Yeah, it seemed like, again, I think I wrote about this in 2012 in a document, not this exact form, but the idea of sort of disciplined, organized, memetic armies. And we mentioned offense-defense arms race, which will certainly happen. Presumably the Twitters and Facebooks will try to downregulate these messages, but obviously platforms like this will try to work around that. But the other, which I think is perhaps more interesting and gets to what you're talking about this might be the politics of the future, is the offense arms race, where let's say these anti-Trump folks build up their army of 25,000. The Trumpsters then build up their army of 200,000, right? And so, as you indicate, this could be the future of how the parties actually communicate. And as we know, online discourse is way less disciplined, can turn way uglier than, say, controlling mainstream media. And the thing that came to my mind is let's think this arms race going through 2 or 3 cycles here. And of course, in internet time, 2 or 3 cycles might be between now and September. And what it might look like is Germany in 1932. Where the various right-wing and right populist parties and the communists and far left parties, of which there were several, were actually engaged in murderous street brawls all over Germany. Hundreds of people a month were dying in really ugly fighting in more or less quasi-organized, and in some cases even paid political street fighters. Essentially, this could be what we're this could be what we're heading for. Some real ugly stuff with sort of quasi-organized brown shirts versus red shirts.
I have a whole report on that, actually, about that looked at the Antifa versus the alt-right battles, street battles, and then I wrote a whole report looking at what happened in Germany on the street level.
All right.
In terms of how
we'll put a post up on that, link on that, our site. I also wrote a short story called Blood in the Streets back in 2017, which talks about sort of Antifa versus more or less legitimate Trump rallies spiraling out of control into violence. It hasn't actually turned out that way yet, but it gives an indication. So I think, we're all thinking about this. And
I have some kind of a subtle critique of the whole approach, though. And it was kind of built on my thinking about how it was used in the counterterrorism space, is that it's not as effective as people would think it is, because Trump's approach, or the dissent's approach in general, is more maneuver based. It's disruption. It disrupts cognitive function, and then countering it quickly isn't as effective in blunting that. The damage is already done, and a subset of those people actually see the counter. It might be good at potentially keeping grooming the in-group and keeping them cognitively whole in the face of this disruption, so they don't feel like they're constantly outgunned. But in terms of its general effect, I think it's going to be pretty weak. I think in terms of promoting a consensus, which is the opposite of the other political party, or whoever that political party is the best way to promote the consensus is to solve the problem the consensus was formed around. And if you're moving that forward, if you're solving those problems, then you're growing your consensus. And that's the biggest failure that the Democrats have had in this instance, is that they have not jumped in front of solving the pandemic. Completely abdicated it. And they're not moving that consensus forward, or whoever, whether it's the Democrats or anybody who stood in front of this and actually said, okay, let's coordinate the efforts to get this thing solved.
Well, the Democratic governors are doing a reasonably good job, certainly better than the Republican governors.
On a state-by-state basis, but there's a national we talked last time about doing that kind of national broadcast, taking in all these open source efforts. there's lots of cool stuff that could be done. I mean, we're talking this morning, or I was talking to some people this morning about the National Guard being mobilized, and there's more National Guard being already mobilized in the United States than the Canadian and UK militaries combined. It's been a huge mobilization that's going through the end of June. And there's a kind of a slot. I mean, these Guard soldiers are out there, at the meat packing plants and in other places, critical infrastructure that's been, taken down because of the pandemic. And they're, supporting the kind of reboot of this infrastructure. And it occurred to me that, there's a whole new space that could be developed, kind of a universal guard, a Swiss Army knife of a mobilization that where you bring a group of people that have the capacity and the ability to learn quickly, and the willingness to work hard. And those people could be mobilized. And once you've, kind of vetted the list, and those people could be mobilized to come into a situation and get that infrastructure going again. And this works at the national scale, or maybe even at the community scale, where you have a group of people that have these kind of, array of subspecialties and or just an ability to learn quickly. I mean, now that we have access to all this information, if you have the ability to learn quickly, you can boot yourself up really quick, very, very fast, and then get them to come in and get a factory going again. And getting the PPE on and doing it in a safe way until the regular workforce can come back in. And you can see this, that could be kind of force that would really be something that could be coordinated at a national level. But, there's this moving the solution set forward is really the way to kind of consolidate the consensus and make it feel like it's actually moving in a direction that has some kind of positive conclusion. And that grows it. That grows the center of gravity, makes it, increases the attraction of it and accumulates more people and pulls them out of the dissent.
You could imagine this little Swiss Army knife militia being unofficial, being, say, an arm of the Democratic Party, for instance.
It could be. I mean, you think of it also at the local level is you have lots of critical infrastructure that could be taken down, and knowing or assembling a group of people that can do that have been vetted and vouched for and are willing to, pitch in and come in and do what's necessary to actually, boot that piece of infrastructure back up after it's been shut down. It's even more powerful if you have a local government willing to fund it. So, willing to pay the people to come in and do this. So you can get all these like positive cycles of reinforcement if you can get it going.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's move on to our next topic, something you've written about recently. The economic shitstorm that's about to land, or has been landing, and will become more obvious in about a month, is going to prune the economic field. There's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. Any thoughts on how we might think about who are likely to be the winners, who are going to be the losers, who are going to be at least relatively stronger against their competition on the backside of this thing?
Right. Yeah. Well, there's the pure play companies that are only viable in the pandemic when things are shut down, and then there's the ones that can straddle both sides. My son's company, Code Academy, his company straddles both sides. They make money when they've been making money when there isn't a pandemic, and they will make money. They're making even more money now that there is. So they can handle both conditions. Amazon certainly in that camp. The strongest players will be the ones that can handle coming out of the pandemic, as well as they're making a lot of money right now during the pandemic. I mean, Amazon added 175,000 employees in the last couple months, so they're making money hand over fist on this. My bigger worry is more like is that the U.S. government is at risk here because we're benefiting right now from this flight to safety. It's keeping our borrowing rates in the cellar. I mean, it's really cheap to borrow right now for the U.S. And if this persists, and if this crisis persists, and relative to everywhere else, it may be something that reverses, and that we'll see people fleeing the United States, fleeing the dollar, and driving up our rates, and that could cause a whole cascade of problems for us.
Yeah, that problem's been sitting out there for a long time. This epoch of cheap money for federal borrowing is the only thing that keeps our even previous stack of debt at $20 trillion from crushing us. If we paid the historical average federal funds rate, which is about 5% across all maturities, we'd be laying out something about 70% of income tax receipts just on interest.
Right.
And so this sword of Damocles has been hanging over us for a long while. And it could be, particularly if we misplay both the public health side, which it looks like there's some chance that we're doing, and the fiscal side, we could be in a world of hurt. We may lose our status as the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, there's benefits to cohesion and stability. And being the most cohesive and most stable country of any size for a long time has yielded us, incredible benefits as the world became more unstable and more chaotic. But if that reverses at all, the decline can be very, very quickly.
Yeah, it could be a phase change, as we'd say in complexity science, where we go from the perception of high cohesion and coherence, which frankly has probably not really been true for the last 10 or 15 years, to a state where people recognize the fact that the U.S. is in a bad way and more or less dysfunctional, even though, again, I would point to the fact that it probably has been dysfunctional for 15 years, but people weren't really aware of it yet.
Yeah, it goes back to my challenge for the 21st century, at least for nation states, is to maintain cohesion in the face of a complex world, which is throwing off, complex crises, again, and one after another. I mean, first 9/11 and then the financial crisis and now this, a crisis that has embedded nonlinearities and has lots of uncertainties. And even if you dig into it, you'll uncover even more uncertainty. That's the thing that actually turns a crisis that, people talk about predicting the pandemic and you can predict the kind of broad outline of a pandemic, but the one that really gets you is the complex one and the one that keeps on giving. Even if you know it's what it is and how it operates, you still can't deal with all the complexity that you're being faced with. It's constantly changing. And, the challenge is ongoing, and it does so much damage over so much time that you end up seeing massive change in the social structures that are built to confront it. And we saw that with 9/11 yielded the GWAT, the Global War on Terror, and yielded all sorts of changes to the U.S. government in terms of militarizing police and et cetera, and spending gobs of money, $6 trillion on foreign wars that we shouldn't have spent. And then the financial crisis obviously did a lot in terms of delegitimizing the government in terms of, its inability to actually punish the people who committed the fraud. So these complex situations or these complex threats can keep on giving over decades.
Yeah. And then this is a very, very important point you're hitting here on, John, which is, frankly, no country on earth is actually very good at dealing with complex situations, nonlinear, with embedded nonlinearities, without the complete set of data. In fact, the usual real world big problem, you only have part of the data. For instance, the pandemic. Well, we knew pandemics happen. Just look at the occurrence rate, about 1 every 10 years. But what are the parameter settings? This one happened to have a set of parameter settings that people hadn't thought of, which is sort of just lethal enough, as we talked about last time, to be
right.
Scary and disturbing, but not murderously lethal like MERS or something, but highly, highly contagious, asymptomatic. So it's essentially a parameter space. In fact, I'm working on an essay right now. I'd love to send you a copy of it for your thoughts before I actually publish it, asking the U.S. government to establish a Department of Wicked Risks, where we actually build up the capability of complexity science, modelers, network theorists, et cetera, and think of it almost like a planning staff like the military has, but for the civilian sector, which will enumerate as many known categories of potential wicked risk, like pandemics, like solar flares, several others, which I enumerate, and does some probing with leading edge thinkers for, all right, what unknown unknowns could become known, or at least speculated upon, and then would actually build models that are parameterized for as many of these situations as they could afford. And, so that, again, complex thinking does not come naturally to humans. We weren't raised in a world where high nonlinearities that play out over short periods of time really impacted our lives very often, maybe a forest fire or something like that, but not too often. And now our societies are going to be put at risk of at least extreme damage, if not actual collapse, by one wicked risk after another. And it seems to me, just like we have a Department of Defense, we also have to have a Department of Wicked Risks.
Yep. And a lot of this stuff has to do with changing our perspective on response. And we try to solve these problems with traditional thinking, and it just doesn't work. I mean, for instance, the way in which we shut down international borders. I mean, we're slow and methodical, and we do try to do it selectively. But with this kind of threat, you have to do it quickly and all at once.
Yep. Because
they're so easy to route around. But it's these assumptions that we have about how things operate, and that we can optimize the solution, and that there's a way to kind of target the bailout money. Or that we should do it higher in the stack and focusing on corporations versus individuals. I mean, all of these things are clearly mistakes if you look at it from a holistic perspective, and looking at it from a perspective of complexity. It's just it's a different kind of assumption set. We don't know the particulars of any given crisis, but we do have the ability to develop a kind of a general response methodology, a way of kind of responding to these things that kind of crisis group that you were talking about, just knows the kind of gut level instinct as to what direction we should be heading into.
Yeah. And can simulate it, right? I mean, gut level is one thing, but having mature various teams, we know, like in climate change, different models give different results. But when you have an ensemble of models created independently that give similar results, it gives a lot of confidence in the situation. So I would imagine this department not only having its own modelers, but also being a fairly significant source of funding to academic researchers to build models using entirely fresh code bases, entirely fresh ideas, and have those models up and running and be ready to go at need, rather than the very halting and whole series of bad decisions that we've seen made. And oh, by the way, it did turn out that there was one simple way to partially at least tame the pandemic on the front end, which was social distancing.
Yep.
And in those countries that were willing to do it firmly and hard, unlike the United States, have actually really pushed their case count down. But the backside is going to be way more complicated. This is not just one simple rubber mallet, right? Now we're going to have to manage contact tracing, escalated testing, and not only escalating testing, but then optimizing. How do you use the tests? Do you use them on people high probability of being sick, or do you use part of that as a background instrumentation to see your base case rates, right? You want to do both, but are current people capable of thinking like that? I don't know. And the coupling between the public health problems and the economic problems are classic nonlinear coupled systems, which are, I hate to say it, beyond the cognitive ability, at least the people I see at the highest levels of our government. So these are going to be, challenges that are. This will not be the last time we face this. So this may be one of the great exemplars, which allows us to think about how we should build some institutional response for the future.
Yeah, I think the modeling aspect of this is great at the very, very early warning period, and then once you have identified that this is a complex threat, then you go, okay, what quick frames can we put on this to make some immediate decisions? And then you do the more complex or more detailed modeling to refine those early decisions. But you can't wait until everything is like all the analysis is done, like on masks or universal masking, right? I mean, do you have to run all the tests and do all the science necessary to prove that it works? I mean, probably not.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny thing about masking. I was saying it from the day one when they were talking about masking. Idiots. The thing about playing on the model, and you could actually find this in a very simple model. The mask is not to protect the inbound; it's to reduce the outbound. Just put that in your model, right? It's just so fucking obvious, right? But it took, a month for the U.S. to come to a consensus. And even that now reluctantly and politically charged, that masks are a good idea. All you had to do was think the one frame change, that this is reduces outbound, not inbound. And yes, masks are cheap. You of course should do them. Why should there have been any discussion about it? But
It was a lesson learned from 100 years of infection control in hospitals.
Exactly.
Why that's just common wisdom in hospitals and common practice, and you just go with that.
Well, yeah, why did it take a month to reach a consensus? And by the way, that consensus is not even firm in the United States. It's now apparently become politically charged in certain jurisdictions to be wearing a mask in public. You will be made fun of by the scoffers. I go, what the fuck is wrong with people? Anyway, let's move on to our third and final topic, which you posted on very recently. Which is, we have these regional blocks of states which are working in a coordinated and seemingly reasonably intelligent fashion to reduce caseloads towards zero, maybe to zero. And then we have other states which aren't parts of these regional blocks, and maybe there's some new regional blocks of scoffers who are opening up very early. And we're already seeing some reports in the media that even the administration's own models are showing, holy shit, this could produce a whole bunch of cases and real resurgence in those areas. And you suggest, could it be that we might have to have hard border controls between U.S. regional blocks? What do you think about that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One thing I saw in terms of behavior in Asia early on is that the border controls were pretty loose in China and other places until they got the caseload down to nearly zero. And then they saw a resurgence of cases, and all those cases were coming from the outside. And so they quickly went to hard border controls, quarantines. They were willing to take that step. And then the other piece of evidence is that, the countries that took early action in terms of border controls, like from Taiwan, Japan, Greece even, saw, where they closed the physical borders very early on in the crisis, have escaped almost all of the disaster that we've seen. So you combine those two, after having won a reduction, and you've taken all the pain associated with achieving that reduction, and then seeing all the new cases coming from the outside, and the fact that if you can coordinate yourself, you can kind of externalize the quarantine and erect borders. You can save yourself a lot of hassle in the future. That will probably be driving the decision making of a lot of these big regional blocks. We see big reductions now in New York and New Jersey, and Massachusetts and others are holding the line. They're not seeing any increase. If those numbers start to come down by the end of the month, and the rest of the country starts to zoom, like New Hampshire's about to open up, Georgia obviously did last Friday. Texas did last Friday. They're all seeing surges in cases. Illinois seeing a surge in cases. Maryland. If those places start to zoom again, it's just going to be a natural development that the states that have won that decline will start to erect borders. And, it's going to be a big shock to a lot of people. If this, those administration numbers from yesterday were pretty interesting. Is that, they were projecting an increase to 3,000 cases a day or 3,000 deaths a day by the end of this month, largely due, and that model was running at about a 50% rate. So it was like 50% of the actual. So in effect, it was projecting 6,000 dead a day by the end of this month, largely due to reopening, up from about 2,500 where it is now.
Yep, and 6,000 a day for people, just to keep in mind, that's close to 200,000 dead people a month, right? Which is 2 months' worth our total loss in World War II.
Right. Yeah. I mean, 3 times of Vietnam every month.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's just staggering because we have been unable and or unwilling to do the obvious thing, which was to shut down. But even states that are shut down, this drives me crazy. Virginia, relatively strong lockdown regulations. The reality is there's huge amounts of leakage. And again, if we'd had this Department of Wicked Risks, the simulations would have said the right answer is a 4-week, very stringent shutdown. Nobody comes out of their fucking house for 4 weeks. National Guard distributes food in bulk, to your doorstop, right, once a week. And that's it, people. A 4-week, absolutely rigid shutdown would have, killed this thing in its tracks. And oh, by the way, we could then reopen the economy fairly rapidly thereafter. And again, the other thing they didn't take into consideration is this slow, drippy, leaky shutdown starts to deplete people's ability for vigilance. It turns out most people can maintain vigilance for 4 weeks. You can stay on a diet for 4 weeks. We all know that. But once you get past 4 weeks, it gets really hard. And I've seen research and I've seen personal experience that says by the time you get to 10 weeks, it's damn near impossible to maintain vigilance, at least for a fair percentage of the population. And the problem with a leaky shutdown is it takes a lot longer. And so we'll soon be reaching that 10-week mark, around the 1st of June, most places. And I expect, unfortunately, we will see further unraveling, even in places that are trying to keep social distancing in place. So should have been harder, should have been faster.
Yeah, the longer this goes, the more at risk the U.S. is in terms of staying together.
Yep.
And that's an outlier. It's always been an outlier, obviously, but it's becoming increasingly possible to see how this whole country could actually unwind. And you could actually even see it in the way people, who have actually been, locked up for 2 months now in Massachusetts and New York, and sitting and watching and listening to people saying, we don't want to do anything. I mean, people who just spent a week or two like in a lockdown and complaining about it in other states and then becoming the source of the pandemic. That enmity, that anger could end up being the impetus to a kind of a soft breakup through these border controls and through kind of, prioritization of resources. I mean, the multi-state council has already, set up a buying group for PPE, and, they're starting to source manufacturing, and you can start to see maybe taking preeminence over resources and, control over resources that ahead of other states. There's a whole mechanism here now for actually seeing a breakup.
Yep. And frankly, I'm not sure that's a bad idea. I think you and I disagree on this one, but maybe not.
Oh, no, I don't necessarily disagree. I mean, I've actually probably more in the camp of actually seeing a breakup might be a good thing.
Good. Because, my view, the way I've said this is it's becoming increasingly clear that California and Mississippi are both getting very, very tired of the other having a partial veto on how they run their societies, right? And that's just about the most extreme version of it, right? But there's sort of at least 2 rough blocks in the country, and 4 or 5 is not unreasonable either. And frankly, they'd all be a hell of a lot happier if they got disentangled from each other, and California and Mississippi didn't have a mutual partial veto over each other's cultures. California wants to legalize marijuana, let them, right? Mississippi wants to outlaw abortion, let them, right? And this might actually be a good thing to release this decoherence, right? Because clearly we can have more social coherence in smaller units that are more culturally homogeneous than we can in what's becoming a very highly polarized country.
Yeah, that's more like 1800s America. I mean, is there a way of kind of an organized retreat where you weaken the federal system, weaken federal controls and limits on behavior? We can, through the, that have been instituted through the Supreme Court, through Congress, bring back power to the states. Or do you see a hard breakup?
Yeah, I don't see it ever happen. People never give up power, right? When was the last time somebody gave up power other than in a radical phase change like the breakup of the Soviet Union? So while, in theory, we could roll back to 1931, but I would bet long dollars against it. And I think to achieve the same result, a much more likely scenario is to actually carve ourselves up into independent nations. Now, we might still have a free trade zone like the EU, but in terms of the...
Yeah, but how did Gorbachev kill the Soviet Union? It wasn't really... I mean, it's in some ways kind of similar to what we're seeing now with Trump and the federal government. Trump may be the Gorbachev of the U.S. Is that Gorbachev, started those pilot projects in private ownership, pilot projects in certain subsectors, and that spun out of control and then he started putting, more and more restrictions on the nomenclatura and they started opting out.
Yep.
They started instituting those pilot projects and starting, grab resources and selling them and making a fortune. And the whole thing kind of fell apart really, really quickly.
Yeah, it was certainly not Gorbachev's plan, right? I actually had lunch with Gorbachev a long, long time ago, and he was absolutely flabbergasted by the whole thing, right? He thought he was a gentle, good reformer, but he was a true-to-heart communist, right? That the whole thing blew up in his face was absolutely unintended. It was not his intent at all.
And then the same thing here is letting the states and individuals fend for themselves on this may end up creating the impetus to actually see things break up. I mean, we're seeing a vast diminishment of federal power. I mean, there's so much. We're not doing anything a confident nation. World War II America or Cold War America is a completely different place than what we're seeing right now. I mean, total lack of confidence in everything and anything. Yep. There's no national will to get anything done, and with forcing people to make decisions on their own in the face of a crisis is the surest way to see things break up. Because they're going, why do I even have you?
Yep.
Why do I even pay any attention to you? And if that's the case, then Trump may be Gorbachev for these states, unexpectedly.
We'll wrap it up on that. Oh, wow, this has been an extraordinarily interesting episode. We've covered some very, very serious ground here, John. Very, very much worth thinking about and seeing what comes next. Hope we'll have you back on the show soon.
All right, cool. Thanks, Jim.
Production services and audio editing by Jared Janes Consulting. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.